is Todd Lewis, the host of the Praise of Folly podcast. Tonight I'm joined by Thomas Hamilton to discuss the Christian creationist movement. So thanks for coming on, Thomas.
Thank you.
So how did you get involved with creationism? From what I remember on your original Cabane 52 YouTube channel, you seemed to be somewhat ambivalent or hostile in the beginning to the idea.
Yeah, not so much ambivalent, more outright hostile. I have a kind of long and twisted and curious history with this subject. I was raised evangelical. I was a young age creationist, as essentially all evangelical children, at least in the 1990s, were raised. Went to small Christian schools. All of them were creationist. When I was 13 years old, I actually went to a Science and the Bible class at my evangelical church, and different perspectives were presented, but they did have some professional scientists who presented, and they advocated very strongly theistic evolution. So I was 13. I found that an interesting perspective. I was also a little bit of a contrarian. I like to stir the pot. And there's no better way to stir the pot at a small Christian school in 8th grade than to start loudly promoting Darwinism. I wasn't necessarily conscious of all those psychological reasons at the time, but in hindsight, it's kind of clear. But I was actually genuinely interested in the subject, and I read a fair bit for a 13-year-old about the debate. Spent a lot of time on Talk Origins, which, if your listeners don't know, is a massive kind of compilation of arguments for the conventional scientific models concerning natural history. And I became a fan of Ken Miller, who is a professor at Brown University. He's a Roman Catholic, very prominent theistic evolutionist. Who testified against intelligent design at the 2006 Dover trial. I believe it was 2006. It might have been 2005, but I think it was 2006. All I know is that I actually became interested in this in 2006. So that was still in the headlines. And so I was fascinated about it from that perspective. And while this was going on, of course, looking at evolutionary videos and content on the internet is going to lead you straight into kind of the atheist corner of the internet. And so I went through a crisis of faith after encountering that stuff, because I'd never really considered why I believed in Christianity. But I had a deep kind of personal attachment to not so much abstract doctrines as to the person of Jesus. And the thought that that might actually be fiction was absolutely crushing. So during this period, I got on YouTube and I started producing lots and lots of content with my very high and squeaky, embarrassing, prepubescent voice. But I was producing 1, maybe 2 videos every day against creationism, all the while going through a crisis of faith in relative secret. Eventually, I picked up The Case for Christ, which I found on my mom's bookshelf. I read it in a couple days. I was really excited by it. I debated some atheists. I lost very badly originally. Not to get into all the nitty-gritty details of it, but eventually the crisis of faith ended, and I was able to find some pretty high-caliber Christian scholarship / apologetics. And I still think The Case for Christ is a great introduction to that kind of stuff. But eventually, this is in 2007, I kind of lost interest in the whole evolution thing in mid-2008, even though I was still a theistic evolutionist. I thought creationism was silly. And I got into Christian apologetics in 2009 and 10. I became Orthodox. I kind of encountered creationism all over again when I became Orthodox, because Orthodoxy, some in the academic Orthodox West are going to deny this, but Orthodoxy is the most creationist large church around, because all of our saints advocated there isn't a single saint who will advocate evolution or an ancient Earth. All of our traditional theology depends on it. And so I encountered it again. And I had a very hostile reaction because I thought the evidence for an ancient Earth and for evolution was very, very strong. And I didn't want to be forced to make the choice between Christianity and Darwinism. So I kind of had an uncomfortable peace with evolution. But, as time went by and I learned more and more about theology, what I started realizing is the problems don't go away. There are a lot of reconciliations, so-called, between the conventional view of natural history and the Christian view of history and the Christian story and Christian theology. And so over time, and this started in 2006 and 2007, and it kept going until 2014 when I finally abandoned theistic evolution. You test out various different solutions and you see if they work. And I kept realizing, actually, if you think these through, and you try to evaluate the arguments objectively, the supposed reconciliations range from highly implausible to beyond ludicrous. And I was realizing that, and over time, even though I was still a theistic evolutionist, I got kind of more and more annoyed by the pompous nature of theistic evolutionists when speaking about theology, because they didn't have the upper hand, obviously. And sometimes they would try to argue that theistic evolution was more compatible with Christianity than traditional Young Age creationism, and that's just stupid. And it was obvious that none of the fathers, when read in context and when read correctly, provided any sort of precedent to theistic evolution, and above all, the scriptures gave no room for such an interpretation. In 2014, I encountered I'd been into biblical theology for a while, and I'd become more and more impressed with the depth and unity of the Bible, and how it all kind of hung together as a single story. 2014, I encountered a guy named James B. Jordan. He's not very well known. He doesn't work in the traditional academy, but he wrote a book called Through New Eyes, Developing a Biblical View of the World. And I read this book, and it was magnificent, because what he said is that the Holy Spirit doesn't waste his breath. So every detail in the Bible matters. There's some point to it. And he just has this incredible gift to look at Scripture and see these deep and profound connections which run through every page. And he has a special gift with the most obscure portions of Scripture. Most Christians don't think about the absolute captivating beauty of the book of Leviticus, but it is a marvelous book, and he has a gift for going through in detail the sacrificial rituals of Leviticus, or the bizarre laws in Deuteronomy about yoking two different kinds of animals together, or the kind of kooky sounding stuff you see in Exodus about two men fighting and a woman grabbing one by the crotch. And he shows that each of these actually does have meaning. It's there for a reason, and it plays into the overall story about Christ. But he was also a very strong biblical inerrantist and a very strong creationist, because he says ideas and history in the Bible and in Christian theology are not opposed to one another. Rather, the divine telling of history in Scripture unveils the meaning of the real world and real history. The example he gives is of the resurrection story, when Mary Magdalene encounters Jesus and she thought he was the gardener, and she sees two angels on either side of Christ's burial slab. Obviously, there's a lot of symbolic meaning there. There are the two angels represent the two cherubim who overlook the mercy seat where Yahweh sits, and Christ takes the place of Yahweh, and she thinks he's the gardener, which is all about Jesus really actually being the gardener, the last Adam who founds a new creation. But none of that meant that the text wasn't historical. In fact, these symbols reveal the meaning of the resurrection story, and it has no meaning if it didn't happen. And what he said is the same thing is true for Genesis. And this, immediately when I read that, it destroyed any hope of ever finding a legitimate reconciliation between the conventional view of natural history and Christianity.
Let me interpose real quick here.
Yeah.
That contradiction we see a lot with very credible intellectual Christian scholars. For instance, William Lane Craig will argue till his dying breath that if the New Testament narrative is not factually true, it has no meaning. But in the very next breath, he'll say the first 11 chapters of Genesis can all be allegory and there's no problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's silly. And so what they'll say is, well, that's actually what the author intended. And, you really have to spend a lot of time in your academic office and not walking outside of it to really make yourself believe that. I mean, honestly, when you look at the text of Genesis 1 to 11, and maybe we'll get into this in more detail later, it's very, very clear that this is intended as history, because you have the genealogies there with people having specific ages, and the sons are born at specific times. And if you follow the genealogy from Adam, you get to Noah, and then you follow the genealogy from Noah, and eventually you get to Abraham, and right in the middle of that, Peleg is born, and at that time the Tower of Babel happens, and then you have long narratives about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and you have a genealogy taking you down to the Exodus, and so on and so forth. You can't cut Genesis 1 to 11 away from Genesis 12 to 50. It will not work. And the only reason people think it will work is because there is an artificial chapter division there, which makes it seem as if there is some actual literary distinction. But really, if you read the end of Genesis 11 through the beginning of Genesis 12, what you realize is actually the chapter division occurs right in the middle of the story. There's no distinction there at all. And what some scholars will say is they say, look at the literary beauty of Genesis 1 to 11, look at how it's chiastically structured, and look at how every word has symbolic meaning and import. And yeah, of course it does. But I can show you those characteristics in any part of the Bible. People shouldn't stop at Genesis 1 to 11 when looking at those characteristics, because they exist in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Romans as well. And so if it doesn't mean that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John are just intended as historical fiction, then it shouldn't mean that for Genesis 1 to 11.
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the problems. You might have already got into this in your sort of backstory,
Mm-hmm.
but what to you is what makes it so important that to the Christian faith that a Christian, whether they're Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, affirm the actual historical veracity of the first 11 books of the Bible? And what is at stake if as a church or as an individual you don't do that?
I think you meant first 11 chapters of Genesis.
Yeah,
but
Genesis, yeah.
So here's the thing that I've realized in hindsight. People will often make the claim that, oh, well, if you say creationism is necessary to Christianity, then you're going to make people doubt, and people won't believe in Christianity anymore, and so on and so forth. But having spent 7 years as a theistic evolutionist, and having spent, let's see, how many years has it been? About 3.5 years. Yeah, William Lane Craig does say that. Having spent about 3 years as a young age creationist, I've actually found the opposite. That theistic evolutionists are constantly doubting. And that doesn't just hold true for me. I've had plenty of discussions with with many, many other people who hold theistic evolution, and they are always going through crises of faith, whereas young age creationists, for some reason, are not. Why is that the case? It is the case because the conventional view of natural history implies a completely different world picture, and one can try to escape from that with all sorts of fancy reasoning, but one is always going to intuitively feel it, because the world picture that is suggested here is that for the vast majority of history, God is effectively absent in terms of the signs of his presence that he manifests during human history. It suggests that humans are basically an afterthought. It suggests that death and corruption, in the sense that Christians speak about it, are very abstract concepts. If one takes the normal view of what life is, for example, that we're biological machines, to say that Christ undid death by the divine glory or by the divine energies just is an incoherent statement. And it's important because when you take the Bible historically, and I avoid that word literal because some texts have a historical sense but not a literal sense, like Isaiah 13 or the book of Revelation. When you take it historically, what you find is that it is a very God-centered view not only of the creation, but also of history. And when you study history in the light of Young Age creation, but also biblical chronology and revising the chronology of the ancient world to fit that, what you find is that God is actively and visibly present throughout history. Yes, God hides himself. That's true. But it is also true that God reveals himself in history, and we don't want to emphasize one of those at the expense of the other. And what we discover when we take the Bible historically is that God has always been at the center of human history. And then when it just comes to Christian theology, there's the question of death. Genesis 3 says that when Adam separated himself from God, when he turned away from God by his misuse of will, God cursed the earth through Adam. And there are theological reasons for that which can't be escaped by saying, well, the Bible doesn't explicitly say that animals are included in that. Because what Scripture and traditional Christian theology teach is that man is the crown and microcosm of creation. That is, man sums up all of creation in himself because man is the image of Christ who unites all things in himself, as the Apostle Paul says in his letter to the Ephesians. And because of that, however man turns, so turns the world. The world's destiny is in the hands of man. And that is why Paul says in Romans 8 that the world waits with eager longing for the revelation of the sons of God, because the world's ultimate resurrection depends on the resurrection of mankind. So if one takes that seriously, and if one understands that Romans 8 is the ultimate answer to Romans 5, which is about Adam turning away from God, what one realizes is that just as the hope of the creation is in the resurrection of the sons of God, so the groaning of the creation is because of the turning away of the children of God in Father Adam.
Well, you know, it's important to point out here as well. Some people, again, William Lane Craig is one of the key proponents of this, is that the fall did not affect animal life. First of all, that is completely contrary to the Jewish rabbinical tradition and completely contrary to the Christian tradition from the very beginning up until like 200 years ago.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
you know, like I was going to quote Romans 8, but you did it for me. Paul said that creation groans, waiting for the sons of God to be revealed. Well, why would nation be groaning if they were already dying before that? Why would we have anything to do with it?
yeah. And I do want to say, because people will bring this up as if it solves everything, there are a few medieval theologians who do suggest that animals could die before the fall. However, they are by far a very, very small minority, and also I think the case from Scripture is pretty open and shut. The question is ultimately whose arguments are stronger, that of the majority of the Christian tradition or this very small minority, and I think it's very clear that the majority has a much stronger case based on Scripture and the shape of Christian theology.
Yeah, I don't remember the organization, but Francis Collins, the theistic evolutionist,
Biologos.
Yeah, they'll say that Augustine was a proto-evolutionist. I even heard William Lane Craig say this, and it's really rather specious. There's this one point I think in his commentary on Genesis, right, where he pretty much says that he doesn't accept the 7-day creation narrative. He believes it was all in one instant, and
Yeah.
the 7 is an order of value. So,
Yeah.
but it's a very minor distinction. But Augustine says in Book 12, Chapter 10 of the City of God, that the Earth is no more than 6,000 years old. So when Collins or Craig will use Augustine to argue for evolutionary creationism, evolutionary Christianity, that's just totally asinine, because Augustine said the Earth was no more than 6,000 years old. He wrote in the 5th century.
Yeah, and there are a few other things about Augustine that are kind of funny when he's brought into this dispute. First of all, when it comes to his reading of Genesis 1 and when he said that it's not a literal historical account, the reason he was saying that is because he was reading the book of Sirach in Latin translation, and he read the book of Sirach to say that the world was created in one instant. So he was actually trying to reconcile Genesis 1 with his reading of Sirach. Now, his reading of Sirach isn't right. His reading of Sirach is incorrect. But the point, it was not because he had studied Genesis 1 carefully and found that Genesis 1 indicated this. It was his attempt to reconcile two passages that he saw to be in seeming contradiction. Second of all, people will always quote Augustine saying, well, Christians shouldn't speak about things they don't know, or people will laugh them out of the room. And yeah, that's true. I agree with that. But Augustine also actually responded point by point to pagans who were making fun of the story of the Genesis flood. And Augustine, in detail, attempts to show, based on his reading of what a cubit is, that it's perfectly possible that all the animals in the world could have been brought into the ark. Now, whether his specific formulation of that argument is valid or not isn't relevant. The point is that Augustine was definitely willing to go to great lengths in order to defend the historical authenticity of Genesis 1 to 11. And
so was Origen, who, despite his proclivity to allegory, still defended the Noahic account of the flood.
Yeah. I mean, there isn't a single Christian in the ancient church who denied its historicity or, by the way, said it was a local flood.
No, I mean, you have Ephraim the Syrian, who's in the 4th century, says there's no doubt at all. There's no reason to doubt at all in Scripture in 7 literal days. I mean, in fact, Aquinas in the Summa Theologica quotes the Hexameron written by Basil the Great to defend the 7 literal day account of creation.
Yeah.
This is not, this is very old, very well confirmed.
And the third point I want to make about Augustine is that not only did he believe in a young age for the earth, but he actually spent time working on his own form of biblical chronology, which was based on the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament. So Augustine was very, very concerned that the historicity of Genesis chapters 1 through 11 be upheld. And the idea that his reading of Genesis chapter 1, which was just an attempt to reconcile it with a misreading of Sirach, is in any way an anticipation of old age creationism or of theistic evolution is just silly. And nobody who has actually studied Augustine can say that with seriousness, but it's just become this canard that gets thrown around. And it's also revealing that Augustine is the only one who's ever talked about, because almost everybody else read Genesis chapter 1 as a historical account of a 6-day creation.
Even Aquinas in the Summa Theologica points out that Augustine's position was the minority position.
Yeah.
It's actually in the section where he quotes the Hexameron from Basil. But I was thinking of you mentioned that Western Eastern Orthodox academics don't want to admit that the Orthodox Church is a very pro-young Earth creationist church.
Yeah.
And I thought of the guy that actually kind of I first found you on. It was David Bentley Hart. I was listening to a video where he was being interviewed, and he said that William Lane Craig was a young Earth creationist, which is patently absurd because I've read Craig. He's not a young Earth creationist.
It's not true.
But even if that were true, he was saying that the Fathers don't support that. And I'm like, wait, Hart, you're Eastern Orthodox. You've read the Fathers, right?
Yeah.
And I posted some comments on the video, and then that's how I saw you. And you posted, I think it was like maybe a year after you posted, but it was similar concerns. And I thought, interesting. You don't see too many people with these kinds of concerns on the internet that don't get immediately shut down or go run and hide. So that's in part what led me to that kind of Eastern Orthodox American context where they discount that. But no, go ahead.
The weird thing is that, when you talk to these people, they will say, "Oh, you're just borrowing that from Protestantism," which is just stupid. I mean, it's not true. If you read what Russian theologians were saying in the late 19th century, when Darwin was still living, they all condemned it. The same thing in Greece and Greek theologians. In reality, Darwinism spread from England to the United States, where it quickly infiltrated Protestant denominations who were otherwise theologically conservative. But actually, if you look at because there were studies done on this in the early 20th century, if you look at the statistics of the rate of acceptance of Darwinian evolution in conservative Protestant churches, those churches were still conservative, but then you run forward in time and you find that the ones with the highest acceptance of Darwinian evolution were the ones that became liberal later on. Theistic evolution comes from a Protestant context. It is complete fiction to say that, in a liberal Protestant context, I know there are many Protestants who completely reject it, but it's a fiction to say that somehow young age creation is a Protestant invention.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. In the 19th century, we had the great Robert Louis Dabney, the great Southern defender, who openly, among other things, attacked the Darwinian theory and many of his predictions about those who gave into it. And what would happen down the road came true. And I would imagine in Russia you had similar foresighted people that could see what would happen once you made those compromises.
Mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm,
Now you had just read Ronald. Well, before I get to Ronald Numbers,
mm-hmm.
you'll love this. One person that I think is interesting to bring up is Father Seraphim Rose. Back in the
Yeah.
80s, young Earth creationists in the United States of the evangelical variety were really interested in sort of popularizing his work because they
Mm.
were using it to argue that it's actually a very old idea, that the church fathers going back many centuries, millennia, believed this, and that their current commitment to a young earth was not new at all, but actually a reaffirmation of original doctrines. Now there will be
Yeah.
those American Orthodox that will say, no, 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 no. Father Seraphim Rose was misunderstood. He was ignorant of the actual facts, and people misquote him all the time. So why don't we maybe settle that issue? Was Seraphim Rose ignorant or misquoted, or was he really against old age Darwinianism?
No, I mean, he was. Firstly, he was most certainly not ignorant of the patristic teaching on the matter, and he was definitely a young age creationist. I have his book Genesis, Creation, Early Man, which is actually it's a compilation of all of his writings and lectures on the subject by his disciples, and he goes very in depth into what the fathers actually said on this subject. And when you read it, it's kind of amusing because he's kind of perplexed that anybody would suggest that the fathers are saying what these kind of theistic evolutionist academics are suggesting they were saying, because they so obviously were not saying that. And the other thing people say about Father Seraphim is that he just he held this view because of his fundamentalist Protestant background. Well, Father Seraphim Rose didn't have a fundamentalist Protestant background. He was raised in a mainline Methodist denomination, and then he became a Buddhist. I believe it was Buddhist, some kind of Eastern religion. There was no fundamentalist Protestant background for Father Seraphim. He read the Fathers a lot of the time in the original language, and it's very, very clear what they said. So anybody who wants to kind of take up the theological or patristic questions should just read the book and make up their own minds, because he engages Dr. Alexander Kalamiros at length, who was a theistic evolutionist and an Orthodox Christian. But yeah, I mean, the scientific arguments Father Seraphim makes in that book are kind of dated right now, but the theological ones are very, very solid.
Yeah. Now, you had just finished reading Ronald Numbers' book, The History of Theistic Young Earth Creationism. I think it was in the North American evangelical context, of which he grew out of.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you could outline some of the contours of the history of young Earth creationism, and maybe some of the commentary that Numbers had, and maybe your commentary on Numbers.
Yeah, the history of creationism is fascinating because it doesn't go the way that a lot of people think it went. And also studying the history of modern young age creationism can help shed light on a lot of the mistakes that were made, which led in part, I mean, definitely not in whole, some people are just prejudiced against such concepts, but in part led to its terrible reputation as an intellectually dishonest movement. So the one real shortcoming I had with his book, I found in his book, was his failure to treat the existence of the scriptural geologists in the early 19th century, because most people begin their accounts of the subject with Lyell, and Lyell he introduced uniformitarian geology and argued that the rock record in the earth could only be explained over millions or billions of years, and the way that it's usually presented is that all Christians simply accepted this, and there was no controversy until Darwin. Now, it's true, a lot of Christians did accept Lyell's view rather uncritically, but there was also a rather significant movement of professional geologists who called themselves scriptural geologists, who held exactly what later creationist scientists would hold that the flood is responsible for much or all of the rock record and so on and so forth, and they argued that Lyell's view was detrimental to the Christian faith. That's the one big shortcoming I found in this book. But it's fascinating, especially when one looks at the speed with which Lyell's views were accepted among Christian circles, and the speed, indeed, with which Darwin's views were accepted among many Christians. I mean, Asa Gray was a friend of Darwin's and a Christian. He basically accepted it without even considering that there was much of a substantial contradiction between Darwinism and Christianity. And it was only when biblical criticism began to develop in the 19th and early 20th century that people looked at it and realized, oh my gosh, if this is where things lead, we need to take a good look at ourselves and figure out how to stop this. Well, by then it was too late to actually stop the movement. But there were some people who kind of went off and argued against evolution, even though most of them still held to an ancient Earth. In the early 20th century, most critics of evolution were just popularizers. They were not professional scientists. Sometimes claimed to be, but they weren't really. The scriptural geologists didn't have any students who carried on the movement, so it essentially disappeared. Now, the first real founder of what we can call anything like modern creationism was a Seventh-day Adventist, and his name is either Clark or Price.
It's Price.
Yeah, It's Price. Yeah,
Gregory
okay,
McCready Price.
Yeah, that's him. McCready Price. If you look at his work, he is a very interesting character. A lot of people will say, well, creationism is just a Seventh-day Adventist view, which isn't true. The creationist science movement was an Adventist in origin, but the actual theological belief that the earth was very young was most certainly not unique to Adventists. But Price developed a lot of characteristics which have persisted into contemporary creationism. The problem with Price is he had some very strange views because of what Ellen G. White said, about kind of human-animal hybridization, and also he kind of identified his own models of Earth history with the theology. So Price argued that the geologic column was just a fiction, that there wasn't any such thing as a geologic column, and that sometimes when you see the layers reversed, that's proof that the column doesn't exist in the first place. And this is still, by the way, a popular belief among creationists. It's just not true. I mean, it does exist, and if you look all over the world, you can find concordances there. And actually, by the way, I think that's a huge problem with conventional models of Earth history. Maybe we can get into that later. But Price, trained a student named Harold Clark, and Clark, I think it's Clark. Yeah, I think it's Clark. Yeah, it is Clark. And Clark criticized his mentor's models precisely in this respect. Clark believed that the order of fossils in the geological record was the result of ecological zonation, that when God created the world before the flood, he created everything in place, and so you had much more distinct zones of different biospheres, which were very distinguishable from one another. And Clark's model, though it has been modified, remains the strongest model for flood geology today. So we owe a lot, really, to Price and Clark. And there was another Adventist scientist named Frank Marsh, who lived in the mid-20th century. And Marsh developed what we call Brahmanology. Brahmanology is the study of different created kinds. Bara is the Hebrew word for create, and min is the Hebrew word for kind. And what is meant by created kind in this context is an original pair or group of animals which serves as the ancestral population for a number of different species today. So the idea is that species are not fixed. There's tremendous capacity for variation within God's created kinds, and new species are produced, but that they are ultimately traceable back to distinct ancestral populations. And Brahmanology is about figuring out which species are grouped with which other species, and which species are descended from a common ancestor, and which species have separate ancestors. This is also a pillar of contemporary creationist science.
For a moment, real quick, excuse me. The funny thing is, that is exactly the theory that Augustine articulates when the old Earth creationists try to hijack it for old Earth creationism. Augustine argued that God created certain kinds that through the period of time could develop within limits to account, but not that they all came from a common ancestor, just that each kind had this capacity to develop. So even on that level, that falls flat. But go ahead.
Yeah, actually, it might be a good point to make a note here that Christianity, and people will take these statements from the fathers and they will misuse them in order to argue for some kind of evolutionary theory. But Christianity is not a religion of stasis, right? It's not a religion of God created a world and it's supposed to be the same way for all eternity. No, it is a religion of development. It's that God created a world which was good, but it was not yet mature. It was a child's world. It hadn't yet grown up. And Adam himself was a spiritual child. And through Adam, who was the generation of the heavens and the earth, that is, the Spirit of God and the dust of the ground, he was the uniting point of those two things. Adam was meant to be the means through which the world would grow up into maturity through the Holy Spirit. Adam sinned, and so Christ came, and he's now the one. He's the first spiritual grown-up in human history. He brings many sons to glory, and now it is the role of the church to bring the creation to its maturity through the Holy Spirit. That is a concept of development. The world does develop and change. That's essential to Christian theology. But when the fathers talked about that, it had absolutely nothing to do with development for millions of years before the existence of humans, which, by the way, involved lots of blood, death, and suffering. That's just a marginal note, because you will find these statements in the fathers, and they're often misused. But back to the history of creationism. So Harold Clark and Frank Marsh were hugely important, in my view, to the history of creationism, because their models really did provide the foundation for the best models in creationism today. So I kind of like to call the best model in creationism today the Clark-Marsh model. Now, this is in the mid-20th century, and at this time, there are various Christians who are scientists who gather together to form their scientific associations, and there's a lot of dispute about what their official position was to be. Now, what one found in these organizations is they all had kind of this inevitable drift towards theistic evolution. And as they drifted in that direction, they looked askance at other Christian scientists who disagreed with their view on evolution. This led to the birth of the first major Protestant creationist organizations. This is where Duane Gish and Henry Morris first started out. And this is when the famous book, The Genesis Flood, by Henry Morris and, what's the other guy's name? Morris and Whitcomb. Yeah. Whitcomb and Morris. That's when this book came out. And
real quick, to what extent was Morris and Whitcomb's flood geology influenced by Clark?
Oh, a lot. They were. The thing is, like, they all knew each other, and in these creationist organizations, they were often Adventist dominated, and this was actually a problem for Baptists and other Protestants who didn't want to be perceived as just founding Adventist organizations. But, by the way, there were a lot of very, very conservative Lutherans who were involved in this as well, and Lutherans had been very strongly Young Age creationists for decades and decades and decades. But yeah, they were influenced by Adventists. But in many ways, I think the models that they proposed in Genesis Flood were inferior to the Clark-Marsh model, because Whitcomb and Morris did the scientific portion of it, and he was qualified enough. I mean, uh, he was a hydraulic engineer, so he knew a lot about the impact that water could have. But they didn't really adhere to the ecological zonation model. They tried to kind of say, well, maybe it's hydrologic sorting and stuff like that. Well, it doesn't really work. But, that's okay. You can propose theories that ultimately don't work out. But this book had a huge impact on the evangelical Protestant Christian community in the United States. But this is not the first time, by the way, that evangelicals had been introduced to young age creationism. Over the past couple decades before that, it had been growing gradually in popularity because of the popularizing efforts of Adventists like Harold Clark, Frank Marsh, and George McCready Price. Now, my biggest problem with what happened after this is what Gish and Morris did with their new movement. Suddenly, they found themselves kind of awash in funding, and they founded institutions like the Institute for Creation Research, which is great in theory. In fact, that's what scientists should do. They should be studying and researching and doing field work and lab work to create plausible models which are in concordance with the data. So Institute for Creation Research sounds like a great idea. And it does do some good work today, by the way. But over time, over the next couple of decades, it kind of became a front for Duane Gish's lecture and debate circuit. So Duane Gish, who was a biochemist, he had a doctorate, he wasn't spending that much time in the lab trying to create plausible models. Instead, he was going around the country having debates with evolutionary biologists and so on and so forth. Now, creationists love to quote these statements from evolutionary biologists where they recommended against debating Gish because they always lose. I've seen Gish's debates.
That's what you and T.B. Scott said.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen these debates. Gish was a tremendously gifted debater. That is the only reason he won. If he had gone up against another gifted debater, an equally gifted debater who had a command of the facts and was familiar with the arguments he was using, he probably would have been crushed because his arguments weren't good arguments. I mean, they were very, very shallow in my view. And more important than the fact that his arguments were shallow and, in my opinion, kind of misled people and gave them bad reasons for believing a true thing, which can be destructive in the long term. Not only that, but this guy was a credentialed biochemist. He had the capacity to do a lot of good lab work, and he wasted his time and other people's money going on this debate and lecture circuit and writing popular books. Now, I am not by any means opposed to communicating science to a popular audience. I hate it when academics just kind of cloister together and never talk to the outside world. However, in the century since Lyell and in the 7 or so decades or 8 or so decades that had transpired since Darwin, evolutionary biologists and conventional geologists had done a lot of painstaking work, both in the laboratory and in the field, developing models which they sought to bring into concord with the data. It was going to take a lot of catch-up time. It was a delusion to think from the very beginning that you could just develop a model which would instantly destroy everything else and was going to be far superior. Developing models like that takes time, especially when you have so few people working on those models. And this was the great mistake that I think creationists in this time period, or this is the first of two great mistakes I think creationists in this time period made, is that they wasted a lot of time and money which they could have used to do serious lab work and constructing detailed and comprehensive models. The second mistake was, and this was not only distracting for the creationist community, it was a public relations disaster. It was trying to get creationism into schools. And this is kind of related to the first mistake, because you didn't have that many people working on these models. You didn't have many credentialed people working on these models. The credentialed people who were participating in the movement were part of the so-called Institute for Creation Research, were usually just traveling the country debating and not actually doing any field work or lab work. And so you can't write a textbook based on a debate series, right? A textbook is meant to be based on rigorously developed and tested models. Now, there are, of course, going to be lots of mistakes in textbooks because the work of science is always ongoing. I grant that completely. But this was a massively misguided attempt to get it into public schools, and it was a public relations disaster because the science really was not ready to be presented to the general public, and if you shone light on it, it would just kind of crumble. And so a series of attempts to get it into public schools with kind of half-assed textbooks just failed. And led to a series of humiliations, which kind of ended in 1987, when it was finally decided that it could not be in public schools. Now, I think the legal reasoning underpinning this was silly, but it is true that the science behind creationism at that time was not very good. And it could have been a lot better, both if they had done research and if they had been more faithful to the Clark-Marsh model.
So basically what you're saying is they had the capacity to do much better given their credentials, but through short-sightedness, they sort of jumped the gun. They didn't want to do the legwork necessary to get it into the schools. They wanted to get it into the schools first and then do the legwork, which is the other way. It's backwards.
Yeah, and I mean, also I think, and Billy Graham was a great man, and he did God's work. But I think they were, and he wasn't presenting a debate case. He was presenting the gospel. But I think, this is all developing at the same time that Billy Graham is doing his crusades, and so maybe they were enticed by that to kind of travel the country and become kind of quasi-evangelists. Now, evangelism is massively important, but that wasn't their calling, in my opinion. Their calling was to do the scientific legwork, which would produce long-term fruit, even if they wouldn't see much in the short term.
Yeah. I suppose we can't help but touch on it briefly because it's often shoehorned into creationism when it really had nothing to do with it. Was the Scopes trial? Now, one of the things that I think is most interesting about the Scopes trial is that the main defender of the Christian position, William Jennings Bryan, was himself an old Earth creationist.
Yeah.
In fact, at the time, there were no young Earth creationists, except the one Adventist.
There's George McCready Price.
Yeah, except for him. And really, of course, it was totally mismatched. I mean, Bryan was a politician. He was not a scientist or a theologian. But it was really kind of a hatchet job. In fact, the guy that was the Scopes, he wasn't even really a main issue. He was just kind of a pretext for Darrow and the sage of Baltimore, I forget his name right now, to just make fun of Christians.
Yeah, I mean, this was the history behind this is kind of ridiculous. I mean, this was a public relations stunt. Everybody knew that there was going to be a big trial there. And so that Scopes was bribed to teach evolution in his class, which was against state law, and many states had passed laws against the teaching of evolution. It was against state law, and he was bribed to do this in order to get a high-profile trial there and bring economic activity to their little town. And, now it's remembered at this great kind of clash of the titans where Christianity was discredited in the eyes of the world. I mean, it's just silly. What's interesting, though, is that, in Inherit the Wind, of course, Bryan is portrayed as a young-age creationist who's humiliated because of his belief that the world was created in 6 days. In the history of the Scopes trial, as you mentioned, Bryan was an old-age creationist, not a young-age creationist. But in the actual events, Bryan was humiliated, not because he believed that the world was created in 6 days, but because Clarence Darrow exposed him as being deeply inconsistent in his reading of the Bible. Darrow was pressing Bryan on why, if he believed the Bible taught against evolution, why, by the same token, can't you say that it was created in 6 days, because it seems pretty clear to everybody else. And that was what actually humiliated him in terms of the concept of 6 days. It was that he didn't believe in it and was thereby exposed as inconsistent in his reading of Scripture, not the fact that he did. So that's kind of an interesting historical tidbit. But yeah, I mean, the way it's remembered today is just kind of silly. And it's been, It's been impacted a lot by Inherit the Wind and the remake of Inherit the Wind that I think came out in 1999. But really, in terms of the actual history of creationism, it's almost irrelevant. I mean, nothing happened there which dramatically impacted the way that creationist research would actually move.
Yeah, I've never read Numbers' book on young Earth creationism, though I've read parts of it to get the context for certain quotes that I was reading. And one of the things that I thought that was interesting, though, is even Numbers had to begrudgingly admit at the end of the book that creation science had developed to a very sophisticated level that could not easily be dismissed with hand waving.
Well, it's interesting because his book was published in 1991, and he's noting that it's starting to develop in this direction. And he mentions Kurt Wise. I don't know if your listeners know Kurt Wise, but he's utterly brilliant. He's a Harvard-trained paleontologist whose absolute passion is for the truth. And he's a young Earth creationist. He believes it because Scripture teaches it. But he hates bad or deceptive creationist arguments because he believes that they reflect very badly on creationists, which he believes are actually right about the issues. And so when Numbers is writing, it's in 1991. I think he had just recently come out of Harvard, and he was spending most of his time going to creationist conferences and critiquing other creationists. And some of the quotations that Numbers provides from people like Henry Morris and others who were prominent at that time, they all really dislike Kurt Wise because they say, well, he's just trying to attack us. He's trying to undermine us from the inside and blah, blah, blah. And this is really reflective of the attitude that was going around at this time, which was very kind of tribalistic, and the truth seemed to take a back seat to them all patting each other on the back. And they all seem to have forgotten about their original interest, which was science itself. Since the book was published, Kurt Wise has been enormously productive in the models that he has put out. He played an instrumental role in the development of catastrophic plate tectonics, which is the best creationist model for geology today. He's focused on the concept of ecological zonation and identified in the antediluvian world a supersized quaking bog, which is a modern ecosystem, but he says it was continent-sized in the antediluvian world, and he calls it the floating forest. And this model explains a tremendous amount of the data that you actually come to in the rocks. And so Kurt Wise is a very, very important case when one looks at the history of creationism, because Kurt Wise began his career always believing in the historical interpretation of Genesis 1 to 11, but his concern above all other things was truth. And so he began his career just by critiquing bad creationist arguments. You have to get the dirt out before you can bring the good stuff in. And through his devotion to God, he has a lecture where he gives his personal story, which is very, very moving. Through his devotion to God and his passion to truth, I credit him with being the founder of modern creationism, and I think that it's his work which has really spurred a revolution in modern creationism.
It's kind of like take the speck out of your own eye before you point out the log in somebody else's.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think you would agree, one of the major triumphs of modern-day young Earth creationism is the Rate Project. Maybe you want to explain that a little bit.
Oh, yeah. It's hugely exciting. So I talked a bit, and I was very insulting to the Institute for Creation Research. But today, it's actually fulfilling its original purpose, which is research. And so it uses its money to fund research projects. RATE is an acronym for Radioisotopes and the Age of the Earth. And it is designed to figure out what's actually going on with radiometric dating. So if your listeners don't know how radiometric dating works, the basic explanation is this. In rocks, when they're formed, they will have a certain amount of a parent element, and that's an element like potassium. Okay, so the parent element is potassium. And over time, the parent element is going to turn into a daughter element. So in the case of potassium, it's argon. So we have potassium-argon dating. And each of these elements has what we call a half-life. And a half-life is the amount of time it takes, given present rates, to reduce the parent element by 1/2. So I don't know the exact half-life for potassium, but let's just say for the sake of this, it's much longer than this, but just for the sake of simplicity, we'll say it's 50 years. So if you start with 100 bits of potassium, you take 50 years, you're going to have 50. Then you have another 50 years, you're going to have 25. You take another 50 years, you're going to have 12.5, and so on and so forth. That's the way radiometric dating works, and you can use that in order to put a date on certain rocks, because if you know the rate of decay and you know the rate of parent element relative to daughter element, you can figure out when the rock was formed. And so that has been used to date rock layers relative to one another, and kind of the creationist argument against this for decades and decades was to point out an anomaly here, an anomaly there, and then kind of move on and say, well, that's it. That is not a sufficient argument, because you're always going to have outliers, and you're always going to have kind of random computer errors and so on and so forth. And if you're just picking out the anomalies and the outliers, there's no way to tell whether this actually reveals a deeper trend, which undermines the method, or whether it's just random error. Now, the RATE project was a collection of several scientists, all of them professionally credentialed, which decided to study this in depth in the lab. And that is the most important thing, because they were doing original research, which is the way you want to do original science. And there were several things which the RATE project produced, and I'll go over some of them. The first one, and in my view, the most exciting one, has to do with helium. Now, helium is a byproduct of some forms of radiometric decay, but helium is also a leaky element, which means that it leaves rocks and floats away relatively quickly. And when I say relatively quickly, I mean over thousands of years. So, if a certain rock has had radiometric decay going on for millions and millions and millions of years, you can predict with precision how much helium should still be left in it, because we can measure the rate of helium's leakiness, and we can also measure the rate of radiometric decay. So if the conventional dates are true, then you should have a very, very small amount of helium left. You can numerically predict it. However, if the rate of radiometric decay is not constant and it was accelerated at some point in the past, then it would have produced the same amount of helium, but there would have been a lot less time for it to kind of leak out of the rock. So if the world is about 6,000 years old, you could also predict numerically how much helium should be left. And you can chart out those predictions, and they are several hundreds or thousands of orders of magnitude difference. And now these scientists published their predictions. They numerically measured out what should be the case, both in the conventional model and in the young age model. They published them. They hadn't done the testing yet. And then they sent out these rocks to high-quality secular labs. So they were not doing the testing themselves, so one can't accuse them of fudging the data. And when the data came back, it confirmed precisely the prediction made on the basis of the young age model, numerically. And that is very, very important. That it's not just a prediction that could come back with a yes or no answer. This is a specific quantitative prediction, and it is enormously improbable that they could have arrived at this correspondence simply by chance. Another point I want to make about this piece of data is that it was published in a secular scientific journal, and they had a booth at a secular scientific conference. And when they published it, they made their own young age views explicit, and they made it clear that they thought this indicated young age creation. So it actually is true that creationists have published some young age arguments in the mainstream scientific literature. And because they were so forthright about their own views, they received actually a fair bit of respect from their secular colleagues, even though the secular colleagues disagreed. Now, some people have tried to respond to this by positing different kinds of errors. I don't have the time to go into detail on all of the different arguments that have been made against it. Paul Garner, on his blog, The New Creationism, it's a defunct blog now, but he has some pretty extensive posts on it in the past, and he's done lab work and field work. He responds to all of these arguments that you find on Talk Origins. Two things are revealing about it. First of all, even though that their argument was published in the mainstream scientific literature, the counter arguments are only ever published on Talk Origins and other kind of internet sites. Second of all, they always skirt around the main issue, which is that if the helium was not at the rate that it was because of the reason they said, which is that the Earth is very young, how do you explain the correspondence between the prediction and the actual result of the data? All of the responses that you see to this experiment are going to skirt that main issue, and I think that's very, very revealing. So this doesn't solve all of the problems by any means. However, it's a very, very strong argument, and it also refutes the common claim that, well, this creationism isn't a productive framework within which to do scientific research, and it hasn't published in the mainstream literature, and it hasn't made predictions. Those are all false. Now, another very exciting point of research that the RATE project did was on discordances in radiometric dates. Now, I've mentioned before I started talking about this, that the traditional way to respond to radiometric dating is to find kind of random discordances and to point to anomalies here and anomalies there and so on and so forth. But that isn't sufficient if you want to establish actually that there's a systematic pattern of discordance, if you want to establish that there's actually something wrong with the methods themselves. Now, what they did is they took rocks whose dates were known, and they took a bunch of different rocks, and they had them dated by multiple radiometric dating methods. This is really important because you hear people say, well, if radiometric dating is baloney, then why is it that all these different methods give the same date? Well, the answer to that is there's no way of knowing if they do, because radiometric dating is very, very expensive, and nobody sends their rocks to be dated by multiple methods because they all think that it's reliable. Well, these scientists obviously wanted to investigate the validity of the method itself, so they did have them dated by multiple methods. And what was revealed was that they actually don't agree with one another. The different methods produce different dates. Even more significantly than this, the discordances were not random. That is, certain types of radiometric dating tended to produce older ages than other types of radiometric dating. In other words, there was a trend line in the discordances, and the trend line was highly suggestive of the theory that radiometric decay had been much accelerated at some point in the past. This is very significant because for the first time in the history of this discussion, you actually do have a serious argument for systematic discordances, which are suggestive that something is wrong with the method itself, and it's not just a random pattern of anomalies. Now, the RATE project did not solve all the problems. One of the things that people will say is that radiometric decay gives off heat. The amount of heat given off by this amount of radiometric decay in such a short time would be overwhelming, and it would melt the Earth. Now, this is actually true. This is what would be predicted, and that is an unresolved problem. But I want to make a point here, and this is a subtle distinction, but it's actually true not just for this, but for a lot of different creationist models. There are two kinds of standards by which one can evaluate a scientific model. One can evaluate its concordance with external data, and one can evaluate its internal problems, that is, problems with its self-consistency. This is a problem with self-consistency, but the fact that it concords so well with external data suggests that as more study is done and as more progress is made, we will be able to understand these processes better, and we will be able to see the solution to this problem. And that's true not just for this, but for catastrophic plate tectonics. And by the way, catastrophic plate tectonics has the exact same heat problem that the radiometric decay thing has. And the fact that these different creationist models have the same heat problem, that suggests that at some point in the future, we're going to find a relatively simple solution which is going to solve both at the same time. That's kind of an extraneous point, but I haven't heard anybody else point that out, but I think it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Go on.
I was going to say, now that we've kind of gone from the origins of the North American young Earth creationist movement to some of its more contemporary successes, where it's sort of got its beginning to get its house in order, so to speak. I think it might be helpful now to turn against evolution and point out the flaws in it. Now, as more of a layperson, I think one of the number one recent scientific discoveries that is a terrible blow to the age of life living creatures being millions of years old is the amazing discovery by Jack Horner's team under Mary Schweitzer, where she actually found the residue of red blood cells in a Tyrannosaurus rex bone, which was allegedly 65 million years old. Now, they didn't only just find the residual hemoglobin. They could use, under a microscope, tools to actually stretch it out. It was still elastic. Whereas the contemporary model of fossilization is that all the organic material is replaced by calcium. So how does the contemporary model of fossilization, where all organic material is replaced by calcium, explain that this red blood cell, the residual hemoglobin of that blood cell, is still elastic and is allegedly 65 million years old?
This is really a monumental discovery. And the point, and when I was first getting into this issue, this was when this discovery was made. And what I argued back then was that, well, you have a lot of fossils and it's possible that there was one anomaly. And at that point, that was okay. You could say that. And I think it was Schweitzer herself, it might have been another woman, who argued that, well, this is just preserved because iron has a preservative effect, and this particular soft tissue was found with iron. Now, both of those arguments have now been refuted because you find this kind of soft tissue and hemoglobin by breaking open a fossil, usually. You have to break it open. Now, traditionally, scientists didn't break it open because it's too old to have any soft tissue in it. After this was discovered, they started breaking fossils open. And what they discovered is that this actually is not rare. You find this a lot. There is a lot of soft tissue and hemoglobin remnants out there when you break open enough fossils. Second of all, these have been found in contexts without any iron. So that original argument has now been completely undermined.
Real quick, hasn't there been a case of a Triceratops horn where they found residual blood tissue? Or
Probably. I mean, there are now so many different examples. It's hard to remember each specific one. But now this is a problem. And actually, on Jay Weil's blog, he is, I think, a chemist and a creationist, and he publishes stuff of like kind of mixed quality, but some of his stuff is good. But he argued, he's very friendly with, very kind of personable, and there was an old age creationist or theistic evolutionist geologist professional who runs a blog, I think Naturalis Historia, who commented on one of his articles on this, and he said this is the one issue where I think young age creationists have a leg up, because there really isn't any explanation for it. It's completely unexplained within the conventional model, and I think it's a very powerful anomaly. Now, of course, I think we have a leg up on a lot of other issues beside that, but it's very interesting that at least one old age geologist admits that he has no explanation for this. And it's not only this, by the way. Another very similar problem is the presence of carbon in ancient rocks. Carbon has a very short half-life. Its half-life is about 50,000 years given present rates. What this means is in extremely ancient rocks that are millions or billions of years old, there definitely should not be any carbon there because it should have all decayed away to trace and undetectable levels. But actually, there's carbon found in basically every rock we dig up. And there have been lots and lots and lots of studies done on this to try to eliminate sources of contamination in the mainstream literature, because it's very strange. It's a huge anomaly. You shouldn't expect it. And so they've done very painstaking work in order to eliminate contamination. Well, they have eliminated all sources of contamination, but it's still there. And so the amusing thing about this is it's so common that in the conventional scientific literature, they have actually established a baseline contamination rate and said, well, there simply must be contamination, and this is how much contamination you should expect to find in your ancient rocks. Because, of course, we know there can't be any intrinsic carbon in these fossils, given that they're millions of years old. But actually, there's no reason to think that it's contamination at all. This is just circular reasoning. And it's a very similar problem to the soft tissue issue, because you should expect it all to be gone, but it's still there.
Well, this brings up another problem, more of a methodological problem. Given that we can't measure rates of decay over millions of years, how does anybody know what 65 million years of erosion or degradation on a fossil would even look like?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to make it seem like it's completely silly. I mean, when you measure rates of radiometric decay, changing those rates does involve some pretty substantial shifts in its physical properties, and it does produce all sorts of strange effects like the heat problem. So when you measure those, it's a reasonable assumption to say, well, these have been constant through time. It's not ludicrous, it's reasonable. However, the evidence coming in now suggests that it must be a wrong assumption, and we should be studying the physical world more in order to understand what exactly happened and why it's a wrong assumption.
Yeah. Are there any other points you'd like to point out where contemporary research has shown more, not just anomalies, but systematic flaws in the evolutionary model?
Well, in the evolutionary model or in that kind of geological?
Either one. We were actually discussing both biology and geology.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll move a little bit to the away from the question of the age of the Earth and towards the question of evolution. When we talk about evolution, it's almost a cliche to say there are multiple definitions of the word evolution, but the different definitions that I think actually matter are almost never discussed, because most people don't recognize them. Now, when most people talk about evolution, they mean common descent. That is the idea that all life is descended from a single common ancestor. And in that sense, there are many intelligent design advocates who believe that God played an instrumental role in the shape that life took over time, who believe in evolution. Michael Denton, who wrote the book Evolution, a Theory, and Crisis, believes in common descent. He just believes that life has unfolded teleologically in order to conform to transcendent Platonic forms. But he believes in evolution as common descent. Michael Behe, who wrote the book Darwin's Black Box, which founded the modern intelligent design movement, he also believes in evolution understood as common descent. He suggests that it's possible that God front-loaded all of the information into the first cell, and it would gradually unfold according to a deterministic plan. Rupert Sheldrake, who doesn't identify with the intelligent design movement, but he's a friend of Bill Dembski, in terms of they read each other's work and stuff and like it. Sheldrake is a scientific heretic about materialism. He doesn't really focus on this question, but he's an Aristotelian, and he thinks that Darwinism is not sufficient to explain the nature of life, but he believes in evolution in the sense of common descent. He just thinks that things unfold organically in order to conform to Aristotelian forms, which are immanent in the universe rather than transcendent.
Another example of that would be Thomas Nagel in his book Why Neo-Darwinism is Almost Certainly False. He argues for a certain Aristotelian teleology that guides the evolution of life, but he does believe in common descent.
Yeah, exactly. So he thinks that the forms are immanent in the universe and that there's kind of an immanent teleology guiding the evolution of life. So there's that
which
kind
of
of
course
common
is an
descent.
interesting concession, because originally conceived common descent Darwinism was anti-teleological.
Yeah, I mean, and the interesting thing is Darwin himself often confused these two different forms of evolution. He would argue for Darwinism, but he would actually be providing an argument for common descent. And so the second definition of evolution is Darwinism. And this is why, by the way, intelligent design advocates often talk about Darwinism. It's not actually a polemical word. They say it in order to distinguish common descent from the mechanism of common descent, the mechanism of evolution. And Darwinism, specifically Neo-Darwinism, has been, for the past several decades, the conventional account of how common descent happened. And it suggests that natural selection, that is the differential survival different organisms based on their fitness with respect to the environment works on the basis of random genetic changes in order to produce the diversity and complexity of life. And I make that distinction not because I believe really in either one of them, though of course natural selection and random mutation functions on some level, but because there is a distinction in how much evidence one finds for these. As far as common descent goes, there is some evidence for common descent that seems powerful. And not all arguments for common descent or evolution are silly or ludicrous. And this is one problem I have with creationism, is they just tend to make fun of the idea as if there were no good arguments for it. One can say there are good arguments for a position, but still disagree with the position. Some of the arguments for common descent are endogenous retroviruses, that is, markers which are thought to have been inserted by a retrovirus which inserts its own genes onto a host organism so that the host organism replicates the virus. HIV is a retrovirus. And when you look at the genomes of humans and the great apes, you find that most of the retroviruses are shared in common. And this seems to indicate common descent. I mean, it's very suggestive of that. Another argument for common descent, which appears to be suggestive, is redundant pseudogenes. These are genes which appear to be broken, but they have an analog in a species thought to be related. So, for example, humans are thought to have a broken gene which used to be used to produce vitamin C. This is why people get scurvy if they don't have enough vitamin C, because we don't produce it naturally. But chimpanzees have the same gene in the same place, but it is functioning. Now, I mention those arguments to say they do seem compelling. A person would be rational if he looked at that and he said, yeah, it does seem like we're descended from a common ancestor. But I do think that there's research accumulating which suggests otherwise.
Excuse me real quick. I would say, though, the main problem that I have with common descent is philosophical. Every argument for common descent could also be construed as an evidence of common design. For instance, all automobiles have similar basic structure: axle, engine, tires, chassis. That's no sign of common descent.
Well, I don't actually agree with that, because I think that it's not just about similarities and differences. It's about the distribution of differences, right? So I ultimately think, by the way, that this mitigates against common descent because we don't actually find this distribution. But Darwin's argument for common descent was that all life is distributed in a nested hierarchy. So if you're a mind and if you're designing something and you have different characteristics, you can mix and match those characteristics in any way that you want to, right? But if all life is descended from a common ancestor, then what you should find is a branching tree pattern. So since insect wings developed after the divergence between the insect ancestor and the reptile ancestor, if you found a reptile with insect wings, that would indicate common design and not common descent, because it would indicate that someone is taking these characteristics and mixing and matching them instead of it producing a nested hierarchy. Also, when it comes to stuff like redundant pseudogenes or endogenous retroviruses, it would be odd to suggest that a retrovirus was planted in a person or an organism by the creator, or that the creator planted a broken copy of a gene producing vitamin C in an organism. But the big but is that I think recent research is starting to undermine these arguments. So, for example, when it comes to the gene which produces vitamin C, there is some research that is now indicating that this gene actually is functional for humans in fetal development. So a fetus actually does produce its own vitamin C using this gene. It's just that the gene is switched off once the fetus begins to mature. So it's not actually a broken gene. And this is actually kind of a sophisticated form of the junk DNA argument. And we're discovering more and more junk DNA. No, we haven't discovered the function for all of it yet. But the trend is definitely in discovering function in junk DNA. And then as far as endogenous retroviruses go, this is an interesting point, and less research has been done on this. However, there was a very interesting article which was published in the creationist literature a couple of years ago, but it was recommended by Dr. Todd Wood, who, by the way, is fantastic. He's kind of like the biologist version of Kurt Wise. He's a young guy, but he's very creative in his in his model build, and he's very concerned for the truth. He recommended this article, and he saw some positive attributes in it. When you look at retroviruses, you find that what are thought to be retroviral markers, they turn on and off in a human being in predictable ways. This suggests that there's some function to these retroviral markers. And then you just flip the conventional theory on its head. The conventional theory is that you have a retrovirus, an exogenous retrovirus is what they're called, X, not end. An exogenous retrovirus implants itself in an organism, and then the retrovirus becomes endogenous, and it is passed on if it's placed in the seed line of an organism's genome. It's passed on to its descendants. If you flip this model on its head, we're actually created with what was thought to be endogenous retroviruses, but they're not actually viral markers. They have an important function. Some of them, by the way, have been discovered to be important in fetal development, and if you turn them off, the fetus dies. If you flip it on its head, God created these markers in various different organisms, and exogenous retroviruses came from endogenous retroviruses. That is, they were a means by which organisms could swap genes and swap characteristics. We know this happens on the cellular level with what's called lateral gene transfer. But what Dr. Wood suggests is that retroviruses, or what we call retroviruses, may be a mutant and kind of rogue form of what was originally designed as a kind of form of lateral gene transfer for large organisms, and that this was designed in order to facilitate the production of new biological diversity. So when we think about diversification among the created kinds after the flood, this might have played an instrumental role. Now, there's still work to be done on this theory, but I think it's a very promising theory. Now, finally, and this is the most important thing, because when I talked about the kind of distribution of differences we should expect given common descent and given a branching tree pattern, it's called a nested hierarchy. We shouldn't expect that there's much mixing and matching going on in the biological world. What scientists have come to discover as they've sequenced more and more genes is that there is a lot of mixing and matching. We know that the human genome was finally sequenced in the year 2000. It was a very expensive and arduous process. The technology has improved a lot, and now you can sequence a whole organism's genome for $1,000, which when you're getting massive government grants is basically nothing. And so in the early 2000s, there was a lot of hope that this was going to solve a lot of long-standing problems and questions, and we would finally be able to build the tree of life as it happened by comparing one genome to another. That project is dead today because of anomalies that have appeared in the data. This isn't the only anomaly by any means, but I think it's one of the most suggestive anomalies, is that there is mixing and matching in life. For example, the same gene that is critical to human speech, to our capacity to form specific and distinguishable sounds, that same gene is found in parrots, which can form those same sounds. Now, this should not at all be expected, because our line and the line leading to parrots is thought to have diverged many, many, many millions of years ago. It is thought to have diverged when reptiles diverged from mammals, because we know that apes can't make those same distinct sounds, and we know that most birds can't make those same distinct sounds. But it's not only the same attribute that parrots and humans have, it's actually the same gene. And that suggests that there actually is a fair bit of mixing and matching going on in the biological world. And that is by no means, by the way, the only example of mixing and matching of both characteristics and genes in the biological world. And this is a huge problem, but, humans have a tendency to do this thing where they give a problem a complex name that sounds really nice, and they say it's an explanation, but it's not an explanation for the problem. It's just naming the problem. It's restating it in some kind of sophisticated sounding form. And so the name that is given to this problem is convergent evolution. And convergent evolution just means that, these two things, even though this trait is not derived from a common ancestor. Evolution just drove two organisms to develop very similarly, and so we say that evolution converges on one point. Now, this is just restating the problem because while this might be an acceptable solution to the development of the wing in multiple organisms, it is not an acceptable solution for the development of specific genes in multiple organisms which converge, even though those genes aren't derived from an alleged common ancestor. That's just, the genes are very specific. Obviously, they're written in four genetic letters, A, G, T, and C. One would not expect that degree of convergence if it's just the result of kind of random chance or similar solutions to similar problems. One would expect different genetic foundations for similar kind of characteristics. Then there's the opposite problem to this problem. This problem is about multiple organisms having similar genes when we know those genes couldn't have derived from a common ancestor. This is mixing and matching, which indicates design rather than descent. The opposite problem is when we look at homology. Now, if you read Origin of Species, and by the way, Origin of Species is a very carefully argued book, and I actually have some degree of admiration for Darwin because he's a very, very careful scientist. And he was, Darwin was less confident in his theories than a lot of people around him. He was very convinced, but he was always asking himself questions. But that's kind of another point. But I don't like the demonization of Darwin in modern creationism, or even some sections of the intelligent design movement. But anyway, in the Origin of Species, Darwin focuses a lot on homology, and he looks at various similarities across wide swaths of organisms. And in the 19th century, I forget the name of the scientist who was known for this, but Michael Denton really likes him. He was a British scientist, and he suggested that the creator had in his mind certain archetypes. And these archetypes form the foundation of similarity across huge portions of the biological world. So if you look at the pentadactyl structure of our hand, and you look at a bat wing, you find the same structure in both the bat wing and in our hand. And there are many, many different examples of that when you look across the biological world. So it's a rational deduction to say that these were derived from common descent. That's why there are these similarities across such a wide diversity of organisms. But since the genetic revolution, and since we can actually sequence the genomes, what scientists have discovered is that a lot of these characteristics, which were thought to have been homologous, are actually produced by different sets of genes, or different sets of genes are crucial to their development. So this indicates that you don't actually have homology, you have analogy. Homology is when you have a similarity between organisms. That's the result of common descent. An analogy is when you have similarity between organisms that developed or was created independently. So you've got both sides of the coin. You have similarities where similarities shouldn't exist, such as between the parrot and human voice genes, and then you have dissimilarities where dissimilarities shouldn't exist, such as different genes producing the same characteristics in traits which were thought to have been homologous. So that's a huge problem, I think, with common descent. There's still, some people, common descent has some decent arguments, but as I mentioned, I think there are more and more problems developing with it, and I think that some of those more convincing arguments, such as redundant pseudogenes, are beginning to be undermined by further research. The other definition of evolution is neo-Darwinian evolution. And neo-Darwinian evolution, as I mentioned, is about natural selection and random genetic mutation. In my opinion, I don't think there's very much evidence for this at all. I think that there are just tremendous problems with neo-Darwinism. When you study, if you read about Richard Lenski's experiments, Michael Behe talks about this a fair bit. Richard Lenski is a brilliant biologist, and what he's done is over a period of several decades, he's studied a colony of E. coli, which is a favorite organism for biologists to study. And in studying it, he's been able to observe changes in its genome and its attributes in real time. And he's done all sorts of things to this population of E. coli. He's separated them, he's put them under different conditions, all sorts of different things. And what's been discovered is that while it does improve by Darwinian means, that is natural selection and random genetic mutation does change the organism, the kinds of changes that are produced are not the kinds of changes which are going to eventually result in new structures. Because the kinds of changes that are produced tend to be the breaking of genes which are no longer needed in order to save energy. And once those genes are broken, by the way, it's very hard for an organism to fix them. And so the changes, while they do improve an organism's fitness relative to its present environment, the changes actually tend to be detrimental in the long term, because natural selection is only concerned about short-term gains. It cannot solidify a trait which will only be useful in the long term. And so there's been a lot of study done on Darwinian processes in the lab. None of them produce what it's supposed to have produced over time. None of them even, and I know people will say, well, millions and millions of years will generate that kind of change. The problem is that while it's true that certain types of changes can accumulate and produce large-scale changes, the kinds of changes that are being observed in the laboratory are not the kinds of changes that are going to accumulate in terms of large-scale significant new structures. That's a big problem for Darwinian evolution. And so these problems are not going away, and they're not just talked about by advocates of intelligent design. In present-day evolutionary biology, the big discussion is about, can we formulate a new theory of evolution? Because while there are traditionalists like Jerry Coyne, Richard Dawkins, and P.Z. Myers who are very upset and think that these other biologists are just playing into the hands of the enemy, most scientists are actually concerned about finding a correct model. And so you have scientists like James Shapiro, who is an eminent evolutionary biologist, who wrote a book called Evolution: A View from the 21st Century, where he tries to argue for epigenetic changes being the foundation of new structures and such. And you have a book called The Music of Life. I forget the author's name. No, that wasn't E.O. Wilson. Music of Life. Well, anyway, the author was a geneticist, and he definitely not sympathetic to design or creationism, but he also is a large critic of neo-Darwinism. Dennis Noble, that's it. He's a critic of neo-Darwinism and tries to suggest different processes which could ultimately produce the diversity of life. Now, I ultimately don't think these alternative theories of evolution are going to work out. But I mean, they are useful, by the way, in understanding the diversification in created kinds. I think they're more useful than Darwinian processes are. But ultimately, in terms of accounting for a naturalistic development of all the forms of life we see, I don't think they'll be successful. And there's no agreement on which new theory of evolution could possibly be successful.
This crisis you mentioned, I think that kind of came to the fore in November of last year in the Royal Society meeting, didn't it?
Yeah, I heard something about that.
I mean, I don't know a lot about it, but I did hear, what's his name here? Perry Marshall and Stephen Meyer give a discussion about what happened, and they both seem to think that there's a certain sea change in the offing.
Oh, there's no doubt. I mean, the thing is, no matter how much Dawkins might wish, or Jerry Coyne might wish, the problems aren't going away. They're not getting solved. And people can complain about getting in bed with the enemy that is intelligent design all they want, but that will make the problems go away. And, I welcome attempts by naturalistic biologists to try to formulate an alternative theory of evolution. That's the way science moves forward. I hope I honestly do hope that they discover some fascinating things along the way, but I don't believe they'll be ultimately successful in producing a naturalistic theory. Richard Dawkins says Darwinism made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Well, now, today, Darwinism is under severe scrutiny. And even though the vast majority of scientists don't want to embrace design as an alternative to Darwinism, the truth is that there is no consensus theory of evolution anymore. There's only the agreement that evolution happened by some means. And until we get a satisfying theory, I don't know why atheists should continue to be intellectually fulfilled. If Darwinism has now been undermined, that seems to me that the intellectual fulfillment of atheism has been undermined. And we should really consider maybe Western civilization took the wrong path when they embraced Darwin. And it, of course, doesn't start with Darwin. But I think that problems are definitely accumulating, and I do think a sea change is in the
It's
works.
kind of an evolutionary dead end, to have a bad pun.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we're about out of time. Is there anything else you'd want to leave us with before we wrap it up?
Yeah. You know, I find that when I'm discussing this issue with theistic evolutionists, they get very, very emotional. And I honestly don't mean that as a cut or as an insult, because I got that way too. They get very upset and angry when anybody even raises this question. And all I would ask for them to do is to really try to think through these issues objectively. Think through the theological questions and really actually dig into the science. Don't just believe what you've heard that, intelligent design is bogus and they don't do real lab work. Actually read the proponents of these views and seek out and read serious creationist scientists who are like Kurt Wise, like Todd Wood, like Leonard Brand, who we didn't get to talk about. And then one last thing, which unfortunately we didn't get to talk about, but which was actually instrumental in my movement towards creationism, was flood stories. And the fact that when you look at various different human cultures, what you find is that all of these different human cultures have traditions that are very similar, not just to the global flood, though that's always present, but to things like the Tower of Babel, to Adam and Eve, to the fall. And as I studied these different traditions, what I found was the conventional explanations, well, it's just missionaries, it's just because floods happen everywhere. They just don't work. They don't work because the distribution of stories indicates that they all came from a central point, probably in the Middle East. So maybe we could talk about that some other time, but that was really important to me. And so I want people, I'm happy to talk to people who disagree, but the big problem I have is that often people just, can't keep it together. And I guess I understand that because I was kind of the same way. But, there's a serious case to be made, and I just want people to be honest with themselves in critically analyzing these issues. And I don't have any ulterior motives. I'm not personally attacking theistic evolutionists.
You're not on Ken Ham's payroll? Are you sure about that?
No, I personally cannot stand Ken Ham for the life of me. And especially that arc. That big, massive arc is symbolic of everything that's still wrong with creationism, that all that money was poured into that arc and not into lab. But, that's another issue. But yeah, the reason I came to be a creationist is because I became convinced it was true. That's it. A variety of reasons led me to that conclusion, and I just want people to consider the facts for themselves and to seek out the best arguments from this position and not the worst ones. And I understand there are a lot of bad arguments out there, but there are good ones too. So my blog is Cabane52, Kabane52.tumblr.com, and I have a whole page where I address called Creationism, where I have 20 or 25 articles dealing with different aspects of this question. So I guess check that out if you want more detail.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on, Thomas. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.